Hello, everyone. I am Amber Liefers with AE2S. I am the consultant that worked with the City of Rapid City on the Meade-Hawthorne drainage basin, both floodplain mapping changes and recommended drainage improvements. Thank you for joining us today. And first of all, I will go through a overview of the presentation. That overview will be, first of all, going through some key definitions so that we are speaking the same language, go through the upcoming FEMA map changes, and then what are the FEMA flood insurance implications of those map changes. I will also go through steps that you can take to reduce the risk of flood damage to your property, regardless of the FEMA map changes and what the status of that is. And then look at, on a city-led process, future drainage improvements that would reduce flood risk throughout this basin. And then finally going through resources and contacts for questions. So on the key definitions, you've probably heard either in the media or from neighbors, something referred to as the 100-year event or the 500-year event. And sometimes you've heard that, hey, we've gotten 300-year events in the last 20 years, or we haven't had an event like that in my memory. And when we say something like the 100-year event, what we really mean is it has a 1% chance of happening in any given year. And the way to think about that is if you think about a large die, and if it had 100 sides on it, and one of those sides was the 100-year event, and once a year you rolled that die, that 100-year event, when it got rolled, would be kind of the way that the statistics work on that. And so you can think about rolling that die maybe 200 times, and you might not get that at all, or you might roll it 3 times in 20 tries. And so that's the background on why sometimes we don't have an event like this for a very, very long time, or we might see more than that event in kind of more frequently than what we might expect. Getting to a more severe event, we have also what we call the 500-year event, and that is the 0.2% chance of happening. So you take that 100-sided die, you make it a 500-sided die, and put the 500-year event on just one of those sides. And again, you can think about the likelihood that you'll get that in any given roll or year is even less, but it can happen. And you think about if you roll it, let's say 50 times, which would represent 50 years, there's a decent chance that you might pull up a 500-year event in a 50-year time frame. So that's what we mean when we talk about the 100-year event, the 500-year event. In this presentation, I'll also talk about the 10-year, which you take that 100-sided die and put it down to 10 sides. That would represent a 10-year event, and a 50-year event would be a 50-sided die with the 50-year event on that. So when I talk about that, just again, think about the likelihood and the familiarity that you might have with rolling a die, and kind of that you might have a lot of events happening in one try, or you might not get that number in a lot of different tries. Next definition that I'll talk about is a flood insurance rate map, or FERM as an abbreviation. And what that is, it's an official map that FEMA issues, and it shows different flood zones. So that darker gray that you see that I'll highlight right here, this darker gray in this particular map is the 100-year event, or that 1% annual chance. And this lighter gray is the 500-year event, or the 0.2% annual chance. And again, it's a map that's issued by FEMA, and then the City of Rapid City administers essentially flood zoning based on that map. And those maps are issued every, new maps are issued every 10, 15, 20 years. So it's not something they do every year. It's not something they do every couple of years. It's an infrequent process that FEMA goes through, because it's a lot of effort to update an entire map. But recognizing that things change from the time that a map is issued, FEMA also has an official process which they call letter of map change. And those are essentially kind of overall general terms to refer to both what's called a letter of map amendment, which I'll talk about specifically, and a letter of map revision. Those change how FEMA views your property and your structure in two different ways. So the first is a letter of map amendment, and what that does is it doesn't do anything about changing the basis for how FEMA determines what a flood elevation is. What it says is there was specific survey information that was done on the structure on the property, and it said that structure was in reality a little bit higher or a little bit lower than the flood elevation at that location. And that structure, even if the map says that that structure is in, this document would say that FEMA is going to treat that document as out. It doesn't do, again, anything with the basis of that flood elevation, just how that structure relates to that flood elevation and how it was determined. Whereas the letter of map revision actually changes the boundary of that flood map and changes the elevations, changes a lot of the basis of it. So this is a different project that we did for City of Rapid City a few years ago. Remember that darker gray is the 100-year flood elevation. This lighter gray is the 500-year flood elevation. And we went through the letter of map revision or LOMAR process with FEMA and changed it so that this blue and red boundary here is all that was left with the 100-year flood elevation, and this kind of this orangish color was the 500-year flood elevation. This is the same exact location, just two different maps shown two different ways. But this process, again, changes the boundary, changes how much water FEMA thinks is going down a particular river or creek or drainage. And then, and it again changes that flood elevation. So that's that process. And that'll become relevant as I talk about kind of this project that we did with Rapid City. The other nice thing is several years ago, FEMA made available what's called the National Flood Hazard Layer. And I've got this link here, and I'll represent that link at the end of the presentation. And if you go to that website and click on the box that I've highlighted in red in the lower right-hand corner, the nice part about this is FEMA takes those firm panels or those flood insurance rate maps and all the letters of map change that have happened since that map has been issued and merges them together. And the other nice thing is you can zoom into your property. There's an aerial base to it. If I go to this previous slide here, this map that's on the right is from that National Flood Hazard Layer. So it's a lot easier to figure out what that floodplain boundary is relative to your property, as opposed to looking at this map that's on the left, where it's really hard to figure out where your property is, where your structure is, and how it affects you personally. So this is a great resource if you're interested in how does the floodplain affect your property. On a local level, on Rapid City's level, nothing to do with FEMA. Rapid City, over the past 30 some years, has created what they call Drainage Basin Design Plans, or DBDP for short. And again, it's a city-led process. A report is what comes out of it, and it essentially recommends drainage improvements to reduce flooding risk to homes, businesses, and city infrastructure. And sometimes those recommendations take a long time to get constructed, because it's best to do those types of projects when you're doing a separate city street project or other utility project. And there's a drainage basin design plan for the Meade-Hawthorne drainage basin as well. Where that becomes relevant is the picture that's on the right is a double box storm sewer that was built under Meade Street. That is one of the drivers for why we went through this FEMA map change process. And so that FIRM panel, that flood insurance rate map panel that I was talking about earlier, the last one that was issued for Rapid City was done in 2013, so 7 years ago. And even though that box storm sewer existed when FEMA went through this mapping process, FEMA didn't account for all the water that can fit through that box storm sewer underneath Meade Street. They assumed all the flow, all that 100-year water needed to flow along the surface. And if you say that it has to flow along the surface, intuitively, that's going to create more flooding, and FEMA is going to show that it affects more properties than what it does in reality. So FEMA's map is overly conservative with respect to saying what the flood risk is, particularly through this Meade Street corridor. And for orientation, I'll just kind of highlight. So this is Elm Avenue, the north-south street, and Meade Street is the east-west street. Kind of to locate yourself on this map. So the FEMA has approved the change that we've done, but FEMA will typically wait several months between kind of their final approval and when it becomes effective, to give people a chance to say, like, either appeal it or provide additional information if somehow that wasn't accounted for. But typically, the process moves smoothly, and on October 19, the map will officially change. And I'm going to switch over from the presentation here to kind of show a comparison of what the floodplain map is now to what it will be when we're finished with the project. And so this is just a different view of the floodplain map as it exists today. Again, the blue is the 100-year floodplain as FEMA's delineated it, and the orange is that 500-year floodplain. And the focus of our revision area was between these red boundaries here. So on the downstream or east end, this is the boundary of our mapping change. And on the upstream end, it's the along St. Anne Street. And this is essentially the upper end of where FEMA has mapped the floodplain. That's not to say that there isn't risk that is upstream of that. And that'll come into play when I talk about that drainage basin design plan later in the presentation. So I'm going to take this slider bar and kind of show how the map will change. And the colors that you're going to see are slided over. So this is just showing the 100-year floodplain, which from a FEMA standpoint is kind of the more important of the two, because that affects your flood insurance that I'll talk about in a little bit. And the area in yellow is floodplain that exists now that will still be floodplain after October 19 later this year. Areas that are in red are floodplain that don't, or 100-year floodplain that don't exist right now, or are not mapped right now, that will be mapped when this is done. The important thing to remember about that double box storm sewer is it starts at Elm Avenue. So there isn't that benefit of that project really going west of Elm Avenue. It's just to the east. And then the areas that are in green here that you see kind of throughout the main corridor here are areas that our FEMA says it's a 100-year floodplain now that will be removed when this after October 19. And again, this is the benefit of accounting for that double box storm sewer that the city invested the resources and your tax dollars paid for. And it shows the benefit of a project like that. And so we want to make sure that FEMA is accounting for that, and this is what this project did. So now I'm going to switch back to the presentation here. So what are the flood insurance implications of this change? And the first thing I really want to highlight is that, again, the effective date, even though FEMA's approved it already, the effective date isn't until October 19 of 2020. And so the insurance requirements, if you have them, are not going to change until that date, even though we know this change is coming. And so, for example, if you're in the, since most of this area is in the 100-year floodplain now and will be removed, how does that, from a benefit standpoint, how does that change your requirements? And so if you're outside of that FEMA 100-year floodplain, it's not required, but it's encouraged. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a little bit as well. If you're outside the 1% annual chance or the 100-year floodplain, again, it's not required, but it's encouraged. Again, I'll talk about that in a little bit. So here are some recommended steps that you should take kind of in the upcoming months to see how these changes might affect you and what you need to do to make sure that you're protected and that you're paying an appropriate flood insurance rate. So the first thing is contact your lender, an insurance agent, about how this change affects your policy. Even though this whole program is through the National Flood Insurance Program that's administered by FEMA, the actual implementation of it is on the private level with insurance agents and lenders. So that's the process. Those are the people that you really want to talk to let them know that there's been this change and how does it affect you. Again, because this is implemented on a private business standpoint, they can require, there's FEMA minimum standards for the information that they have to have, but different businesses will require different levels of information. So ask what information they will require to make any insurance changes, because it does vary between lenders. And ask your lender if you're paying flood insurance at a particular rate and your rate goes down, ask if you might be eligible for a partial refund. There's no guarantee for that, but there, again, because it's implemented on a private level, some lenders and some insurance agents may provide a partial refund, again, because we know that right now that map is going to change, but it's going to take several months for that to become actually effective. And the other thing is that even though that process that we went through with the city, this letter of map revision, you still may need additional documentation depending on the lender to remove the insurance requirements or change them. And that goes to that letter of map amendment or that LOMA process that I talked about of they might require a survey of your particular house or structure to determine that you are indeed out. And contact the city for more information on that, and I'll have that information, that actual contact information at the end of the presentation. So what can you do to reduce the risk of flood damage or reduce the losses that you would experience if a flood were to happen? If you're in the 100-year floodplain, or if you're in the 500-year floodplain, or you're just a little bit out, what are things that you can do to protect yourself? I'm gonna get a little drink here. So the first thing, I can't emphasize this enough, flood insurance, flood insurance, flood insurance. FEMA implements their program on a national level. They have somewhat arbitrarily decided that the 100-year floodplain or the 100-year flood is kind of the line in the sand for when they require flood insurance and when they don't. There is always a bigger flood. There are unmapped flood risks throughout the property, and I'll talk a little bit about that later as well. There are things that FEMA doesn't account to. So let's say a culvert gets clogged with debris. I'm not saying it's likely, but if it happens, FEMA doesn't take into account that, and flooding can happen beyond what FEMA has accounted for. So flood insurance, if you're in or close to a floodplain, or if you think you have any risk at all, flood insurance can be a very valuable investment. And on that topic, I was talking to a landowner last year, and they weren't in a FEMA map floodplain, and they had, you know, they had seen water kind of get onto their property, but you know, they had never been flooded out before. So they finally decided, you know what, I should get flood insurance. And so they bought flood insurance. And 2 months later, there was a flood that was well in excess of the 100-year event. They had 3 feet of water throughout their whole house, a lot of losses. But because they had flood insurance, everything was covered, and so that I would just point that as a success story of how flood insurance can benefit you if you have any flood risk at all. In terms of improvements that can be made interior to your house or around your house, there are ways to prevent sewer backups. So even though flood water goes in different pipes and doesn't go into the same sewer that your toilet water, your washing machine water go into, when the ground is wet, water inevitably can leak into the sanitary sewer, and it's just the way it is. And that can cause the sewer to back up and flood out people's basements sometimes. That's one of the reasons I'm a floodplain engineer, is because the house I grew up with, this happened a lot, and so I spent many nights bailing out my basement that I grew up in. And so that's one of the reasons that really kind of got my attention to that this can happen, and it does happen. Another thing is installing sump pumps. This is fairly common, especially in newer homes, but they can be retrofitted as well. A great thing if you get some water in your basement to be able to pump that water out in a short amount of time. Another thing you can do is improve the lot drainage around your house. So, you know, get the ground built up so it slopes away from the house, so that if you do get water from either your downspouts or, you know, nothing to do with a big flood, but just related to roof drainage and water coming up and along your property, getting that ground to slope away from the house can prevent water from coming into it. It's a valuable kind of low cost improvement that can be done in a lot of places. On a kind of maybe bigger scale, is there are things you can elevate homes. You can basically jack up a home off its current foundation, extend the current foundation, or pour a brand new one to get that structure elevated above the ground that's adjacent to it. We've seen this done in a number of places when that flood risk is particularly high. So you would still have water around the structure. During a flood, it doesn't really change the grades around it, but what it would do is prevent that water from getting into the structure. So it can be a valuable improvement if a particular structure floods frequently, or you have an investment that you want to protect. This is an improvement probably more than I've seen on the commercial side, but it can be. There's nothing to say that it can't be done on the residential side as well. The area, the kind of the point that I've highlighted in yellow here, and I'll pull up my laser pointer. These kind of metal brackets here are meant to hold essentially a temporary floodgate. So there's floodgates that are stored inside this building. And if there's a warning of a flood, they go out and they put them in, and that keeps water from coming into the structure. This particular business has been flooded a number of times, and so they've made that investment on all their openings to prevent that damage from even, again, having water up against the building versus it coming into the building is a very big difference in terms of flood damage. So now I'm going to switch to, again, kind of that more local, Rapid City-led process, which is the drainage basin design plan. And how is it the same? How is it different than FEMA's process for mapping flood risk or showing flood risk. And the city drainage basin design plans are much more about kind of a comprehensive flood risk evaluation throughout the drainage basin and developing improvements for that. Whereas FEMA only shows kind of, first of all, what's out there right now. They don't do anything with what can we do to improve that. And they really only focus on kind of these larger drainages. Again, they're administering a program on a national level, so they can't look at, well, my street floods because the storm sewer inlet didn't have capacity. FEMA's, that's not their purview, that's not their focus, whereas the city has a focus that extends beyond administering FEMA floodplains. And so that's how drainage basin design plans fit into kind of this overall understanding of flood risk. The goal is not to eliminate any flooding risk. The goal is, of a drainage basin design plan is to reduce flooding to an acceptable standard. For example, a standard would be structures are protected or not flooding in the 100-year event would be an example of a standard. And again, the city evaluates flood risk in a much more comprehensive manner than FEMA and uses different standards for doing that. And so those maps can be a little bit different. And the goal is that the city has a better understanding potentially than FEMA does of what that flood risk is. And so the next few slides, what I'm going to show is a comparison of the 10-year, again, think 10-year, think a 10-sided die, 50-year and 100-year flood risk, and how does that affect, potentially affect residences and businesses throughout the Meade-Hawthorne drainage basin. So there's a lot going on in this map. I will take a little bit to explain what's going on here. So the first is for orientation. On the far left-hand side, the north-south street here is Mount Rushmore Road. And then this is a map, or the map of the city going east. This is Elm Avenue, North-South Street, St. Francis Street running to the east. And then this map ends, but then if you, for comparison, if you focus on this kind of green strip right here, that lines up with this green strip here. So this map continues further to the east. Campbell Street here, St. Joseph, Highway 79 is the angled street here, and then Rapid Creek is on the far right-hand side of this map. So these maps kind of just, they're shown on top of each other, but they're meant to go from west to east. The other thing I want to highlight here is this blue boundary that you see here. That's the outline of the 10-year flood risk based on kind of this drainage basin design plan approach that the city has. So that shows, again, the extensive, the 100-year or the 10-year flooding kind of along these main drainages. And for comparison, this is St. Anne Street. This is the upper limit of what FEMA maps for their floodplain. So you can, again, I want to illustrate that there's flood risk that is beyond what FEMA has, because FEMA, that's really not their purview. The different colors that you see here are different parcels that are coded 3 different colors. The first is that it's a parcel, it's shown in green, where the parcel is flooded, but it's just a front yard, or it's just a side yard or backyard. There's no risk or no apparent risk to a structure on that parcel. The second one is the ones that we've shown in orange, and orange are where we, based on the flood extents, it looks like a garage is probably flooded, or the house or the business might be flooded, but it's hard to determine, again, because we're looking at a still somewhat of a high level. And then the ones that we've highlighted in red are parcels that have the primary structure, the house or business. It appears that those structures would be at risk flooding in this 10-year event. So you can see that there are some structures that are colored red. There's some parcels that are colored red, some that are colored orange, and most of them colored green. The last thing I want to highlight on this slide is this table here at the top. And so we kind of did the same breakdown and kind of categorized the number of parcels that have these different categories of land. Only the land or the green part of the property or the driveway is flooded, where the primary structure is potentially flooded, or it's the garage, and then it looks like the primary structure is likely flooded. So here's the number of parcels, and then we broke it down by the total structure assessed value, the land assessed value, and the total assessed value. And the reason we did that was we wanted to illustrate kind of the investment that the community members themselves have made in Rapid City that is at some level of risk for flooding. And this really kind of starts to illustrate kind of the value again of, for example, those improvements that were done in Meade Street, the value of those improvements to reduce that risk. And then we also, to kind of illustrate this a little bit more, is we took a multiplier of kind of those assessed values. So for example, if just like the front yard or the driveway is flooded, the actual damage from that is usually fairly negligible. So we put a cost on that, or a value of essentially 0%. Whereas if the garage might be flooded, that's typically has less value than the primary structure, or the primary structure might be flooded, so it might not be. We assigned a multiplier of 25%. A little arbitrary, but just kind of gives you a sense of like if the structure, the house is likely flooded versus possibly flooded, there's a difference there. So we assigned the value of our multiplier of 25%. And then if the primary structure looks like it's likely flooded, we assigned a multiplier of 100% on that. And this, $11.4 million of community investment by Rapid City residents is potentially at risk for flooding in the 10-year event. So again, illustrating kind of the value of improvements to take that number down. Moving on to the 50-year event, and the map's going to look exactly the same except for a 50-year event. You can see a lot more red show up in the 50-year event. So there's a substantial change and a substantial increase in flood risk when we go from a 10-year event, again, think a 10-sided die, to a 50-year event, 50-sided die. Less likely to happen, but when it does happen, and it will happen at some point, that there is significant chance of risk. And I'll just kind of turn to kind of the summary here in this table. So we went in the 10-year event, we went from about 11.4 million. In the 50-year event, there's $22.7 million worth of community investment in houses and garages, in businesses that has some potential flood risk in the 50-year event. And then moving up to the 100-year event, there is, here's the 50-year, here's the 100-year. You can see some increase, particularly on the east end of the watershed near St. Joseph. And we went from 22.4 million up to a little over 32 million. So again, if a 100-year event, again, that one side and 100 sides of a die, when that event happens, this is the kind of investment that the community has made by its residents that's at a risk of some level of flooding. So, that again really informs kind of, okay, how do we think about improvements and what might be a valuable improvement? And so we looked at different approaches to reduce that flood damage. And there's a lot, when you start a project, there's lots of different ways that it can be done. And we really want to emphasize also that The options that we looked at are only options. They're only something viable if they're funded, or if the city or its residents say, yes, this is something we really want to do. At this point, they are options that we've presented. And I'll kind of give a kind of high-level overview of kind of 3 different themes of options that we looked at. And the first one is, so all the structures that are orange and some of the ones that are colored orange, buy them out. That's certainly it's always an option. FEMA really likes that option because it really eliminates the risk. But from a community standpoint, there's a lot of drawbacks that potentially come into play. So with if we bought out all the structures that have flood risk, again, the benefit is it really eliminates the risk. The house or the business is gone, it's green space, so it might still flood, but the damage has been eliminated. The drawbacks, the significant drawbacks, I should say, are cost. Well, this table here shows that if we would buy out the 10-year structures that are affected by the 10-year flood, we're looking at something north of 11 million. All the way up to the 100-year event, you'd be looking at over $32 million. The other thing is a social impact. Housing availability is a challenge in Rapid City. That's a testament to your community. But if you essentially eliminate, let's say, 50 homes or 100 homes, that really comes down to eliminating essentially equity and affordable housing within Rapid City. And so for those reasons, this option wasn't considered further as an option in and of itself. It was more evaluated and presented as an option to compare to other different options. And the other 2 options I'll present together because what we looked at was kind of a blend of them. And the second option is absolutely no buyouts. All the improvements are within city-owned or city-dedicated areas. So, for example, that box storm sewer that was under Meade Street, the picture on the left, that's what it looks like when it's done. You don't see it, but it still functions. The challenge of that is getting the water into that pipe. So there's some drawbacks to that approach, but it's certainly an effective approach, as the mapping change that I described earlier shows. The other option in this option 2 is improving channel capacity. That's the picture on the right. The Meade-Hawthorne Basin has a number of these types of channels in them. And if they're expanded or modified, they could provide additional capacity and reduce flood risk as well. So that's really what option 2 says. All the improvements need to be focused inside the city right away. Option 3 is kind of a hybrid approach of option 1 and option 2. So it's some buyouts, and with those buyouts, you might be able to create some flood storage to reduce flows going downstream, but it's also looking at increasing that capacity under streets. The picture on the left here is a project that we worked on, not in Rapid City, where we did that exact same thing, and the picture on the right is the same project. So that project that we worked on for that community took this option of kind of this hybrid approach of some buyouts for strategic flood storage, but really also focusing on under the street improvements to reduce flood risk. And so the next series of slides that I'm going to go through kind of walks through those different kind of option 2 and option 3 improvements that we looked at various locations throughout the watershed to reduce that 100-year flood risk. So this is just an overview map. The base map is that 100-year flood risk that I was showing a few slides back. And the first one we're going to look at is improvements along St. Francis Street, kind of going east from Mount Rushmore Road. That's kind of the thicker yellow outline that I've noted here. And what those improvements would look like is it's 3 different improvements. The first is constructing a, let me turn my highlighter, constructing a short flood wall along Mount Rushmore Road and then turning along St. Francis Street to prevent water from the intersection of Mount Rushmore Road flowing into the low area that's next to the Walgreens to the north of St. Francis. The second improvement in this kind of area would be lowering St. Francis Street for a section going east from Mount Rushmore Road. And the reason for that is that this building right here sits lower than the street, and that's usually a recipe for flood damage because water can easily leave the street, flow through the parking lot and into the building. So if we lower that, water will keep going down St. Francis Street. The third improvement, the kind of the larger one of this particular option, is focused a little bit further east, and it would essentially create flood storage, a detention basin that's kind of generally what we've schematically shown kind of in this outline here. The shape, the location, the exact location, this is all conceptual. It's not saying that this is exactly the plan. But what's really important is this volume and generally where it's at. So this 6.5 acre feet. So an acre foot is an acre, so about 250 feet, 220 feet by 220 feet, and then a foot deep. So it's a volume. And that 6.5 acre feet is essentially the most important part of this type of a detention basin. And this Q100, that's the flow that's going into the basin, is 185 cubic feet per second. So imagine a foot, a cube that's a foot by a foot by a foot. And every second, 185 of those are moving past a point. And the flow that's coming out of it is only 70 cubic feet per second. So this detention basin would decrease the flow going down St. Francis Street quite a bit. The flow would come out of that detention basin, go into new storm sewer that would tie in with the existing storm sewer that's shown in purple here. What these improvements would do is all these kind of light pinkish color shades would remove the 100-year flood risk from those parcels. So you can kind of see, again, that benefit of these improvements and the associated flood risk reduction that occurs from them. In terms of what these improvements would cost, so the combined cost of these would be about 1.2 million, but those costs do not include any land acquisition that would be needed, which would certainly be needed in this particular location to provide that storage that we've accounted for. So that's the kind of a summary of kind of improvements from Mount Rushmore Road to 5th Street along St. Francis Street. The next kind of area of improvement that we looked at was to the north, kind of in the St. Andrew, St. Charles Street area between 5th and 3rd Street. Kind of again, the thicker yellow outline is kind of that area. And what that improvement what would look like, I guess, first of all, kind of there's flood risk kind of in this low area where the houses are, particularly on the south end of that alley. Flow kind of comes through here and wants to run kind of through the properties into St. Andrew Street. So what we looked at there was constructing some high capacity inlets. Remember how I talked about if we increase storm sewer capacity, we have to get the water into it as well. And then constructing a 60-inch storm sewer going east on St. Charles to 3rd and then turning south on 3rd to St. Andrew to tie in with the existing storm sewer. You can see that the downstream pipe is an existing 48-inch and we would be constructing a 60-inch. We wouldn't be overwhelming that existing 48 because that 48 it has is steeper pipe, and so it has more capacity than the 60-inch, which has to be pretty flat in this area. So that's the reason for the pipe size change. And we would keep the existing 36-inch pipe that runs down the alley between St. Charles and St. Andrews, because we want to take advantage of, again, the improvements that have already been made. We don't want to abandon those if we can avoid it. From a cost standpoint, this cost would be about $825,000. Since we'd have to rip up the parts of the street, we'd have to certainly restore it. And storm sewer, when we start looking at a 16-inch size, is expensive. But one of the advantages of this approach is that land acquisition is not needed at all for this particular improvement. The third area that we looked at, and this is kind of one of the bigger footprints of the improvements that we looked at, is going essentially kind of moving to the east of 3rd Street and kind of going towards Elm Avenue, which is on the right-hand side. And since this is kind of one of the major corridors of flood risk through the Meade-Hawthorne Basin, and there are several different ways that it can be reduced. We looked at 3 different alternatives for this option. The first is there's a lot going on again in this map. So the first improvement is looking at St. Patrick Street, and it would be lowering St. Patrick Street, going east from 3rd Street all the way to 1st Street. And the reason for lowering St. Patrick Street is because the street elevation is very close to the existing homes that are on the north and south side of the street. And so it doesn't take much flooding in St. Patrick Street to start affecting homes and properties. And so by lowering it, water can more efficiently move along the street corridor versus flooding properties that are adjacent to it. The second improvement in this stretch is constructing a large regional detention facility. Remember how I was talking about the acre feet of storage? So the one I talked about a couple of slides ago was 6.5 feet of acre feet storage. This one would be 40 acre feet of storage. And in order to create that kind of volume, you need a pretty big footprint. So that it takes up and also making it as deep as possible, so we take up as small of a footprint as possible. And that's kind of the parcels that are shown in green. Again, the exact location is still, this is conceptual. It doesn't say that, again, this is exactly where it's going to be, and these are exactly the parcels that are affected. The final set of improvements in this stretch for this kind of alternative of improvements is this is an existing channel. I'll turn my laser pointer on here. Going south from St. Anne Street, there's an existing channel that goes south and then turns to the east to Elm Avenue. What we would do is construct kind of a drop structure and then extend the existing box storm sewer that's in Meade Street to tie in with that channel, so that we're maximizing the capacity and the ability to get water off the surface and into the storm sewer system where it doesn't have a flood risk. So that's essentially kind of a summary of kind of this first alternative. The capital cost for this is about $7 million, so would be a significant cost, and there would also, in addition to that, be significant land acquisition that would be needed. The second alternative that we looked at, recognizing again kind of the social impact of significant land acquisition, is something that at least we want to present an option that would avoid most of that. Is looking at essentially improvements. So for orientation, this is St. Francis Street, St. Anne Street, and then Elm Avenue running north-south. So similar, kind of go in reverse in terms of direction here. So this is Meade Street again, and then extending that storm sewer, but instead of it being a single 8-foot by 6-foot box, it would be a double 8-foot by 6-foot box, because this option does not include detention in the associated, or the land acquisition and the associated detention that would be created from that. Similar drop structure, and then we'd also have to expand this open channel so it has more capacity, and then also construct a new 10 by 6 box storm sewer running to the running along St. Anne Street, turning north on Lincoln. And then remember again how I talked about, if we build capacity underground, we need to provide the capacity to get the water into that system. And so we'd have a number of high capacity inlets and kind of a custom inlet structure to really make sure that that water gets in, has a chance to get into the pipe, so that it's off the surface and in avoiding flood risk. The capital cost for this improvement is about 4.7 million, so compared to 7 million in the previous kind of version of this area. And the other aspect of this that's, again, important to note is that land acquisition, it would still be needed, but it's quite minor. I believe it's like one parcel that would have an impact that's outside of the city right away. This alternative, kind of compared to that first alternative, again, significantly less land acquisition. It's less costly than the previous alternative. The biggest downside is that this one does not reduce downstream flows. This merely moves it through kind of this corridor more efficiently. And so you're still seeing that same or slightly increased flows going downstream. The final alternative that we looked at for this corridor was an alternative that was presented by a previous consultant a number of years ago, and it's just a similar variation of the previous option. So again, here's Meade Street. It would be taking a 14 by 6 box storm sewer running to the west, or it would be flowing to the east, going along Grand Boulevard to Lincoln, going north on Lincoln, and then turning to the west on St. Francis Street, and box storm sewer of varying size. And the cost of this is higher than the previous option that we presented. It's 6.1 million. The land acquisition would be also minor, primarily consist of easements. And so from a comparison to the other alternative, it's the least land acquisition from the previous alternatives, but it's I would say very similar to the second alternative. However, it's $1.5 million more expensive than that second option that we presented. And similar to that, it also does not reduce downstream flows. The other big drawback to this alternative is you can see that there weren't any parcels, or there aren't any parcels that are kind of shaded that shows removal here. And the reason why on this particular alternative is this alternative didn't really look at how do we get the water into that box storm sewer as a project in and of itself. There would be substantial additional improvements beyond this particular project in order for this system to function as it's intended, as it was designed or conceptually evaluated a number of years ago. So that would be probably one of the bigger drawbacks of this approach versus the other two approaches. Moving on to a little bit further downstream to kind of the intersection of Meade Street and Birch Avenue, and kind of that, again, that area that's kind of shown in the thick yellow outline. So the this project is much smaller in footprint, kind of a much more localized benefit. Again, for kind of orientation, Meade Street, this kind of lighter purple, that's the double box storm sewer that's running under Meade Street. But there's also an existing concrete channel that runs in the back of these properties here. And what this proposed 72-inch connection between those would provide a kind of a balance of capacity. So there'd be, right now there's some excess capacity in the double box storm sewer, and the channel is over capacity. And so this provides an opportunity for that water to get out of that channel and connect up to that box storm sewer, again, getting the flood waters off the surface and into the storm sewer where they don't create damage. I've highlighted kind of in this kind of yellow or light blue-green color. These would be the parcels that would be removed from the 100-year floodplain if this improvement were to be constructed. Capital cost is about $350,000, and land acquisition would be minor. There'd be one storm sewer easement that would be needed to connect up to that existing concrete channel. A little bit further downstream, so this is a different kind of the overview map again shows the 100-year floodplain based on the drainage basin design plan process, but the kind of the overview map has been shifted to the east for orientation. We have St. Joseph Street, the diagonal street here, Campbell Street running straight north-south, and again Meade Street being running along here. So there's two different kind of sets of improvements looked at kind of in this kind of stretch where the Meade-Hawthorne drainage has primarily is in an open channel. We group them into essentially kind of east and west of St. Joseph Street. So on the west side of, or west of St. Joseph, what we looked at is improving kind of the three road crossings, Aspen, Huffer, and this local bridge that's extended off of Cherry Avenue. And those bridges don't have sufficient capacity right now, and so they would need to be replaced with 4 10x8 or 10x7 box culverts underneath them, or the equivalent bridge size. And then in addition, starting right about here and going downstream, that channel capacity would need to be expanded because that channel does not have the current capacity right now. If those improvements would be constructed, the parcels that are shown in green here would be removed from the 100-year floodplain based on the drainage basin design plan analysis. So these improvements would have kind of a significant benefit in this particular area. The cost of those improvements would be about $4 million. There would be some land acquisition needed in order to expand the capacity kind of through this area. This parcel here will be affected to create that additional capacity. Finally, on the east side of St. Joseph Street, the channel itself has capacity where the restrictions are at 3 different crossings. Crossing on the east end here, Campbell Street, and then there's this private or this access road that crosses the channel just downstream of St. Joseph and the railroad. And those culverts would need to be upsized, or those current culverts or bridges would be upsized to 4 10x10 box culverts or an equivalent bridge. And the cost of those would be about $3.5 million. And the other one nice thing about this is that there would be no land acquisition needed because the improvements that would be necessary are local or specific to those culvert crossings. So on the drainage basin design plan, just kind of wanted to kind of summarize and kind of provide some key conclusions from that work that we did for the city. Infrastructure improvements can reduce flood risk. That Meade Street box storm sewer that the floodplain map reflects now very much illustrates that, and the work that we did kind of through this drainage basin design plan also illustrates that, that improvements can reduce flood risk. The most cost-effective approach might be a combination of buyouts with some infrastructure improvements, but recognizing that any buyout plan would have an impact to housing in the city, and that's certainly a social consideration that needs to be understood prior to any pursuit of any sort of buyout plan. There's a significant cost to any approach. These aren't cheap improvements that are necessary or that we evaluated. However, the potential flood damage that exists is also would be a cost when those floods do occur. And there would likely be benefit to coordinating with other city, street, and utility projects. So, for example, if we, in the cost that we presented, if it requires ripping up a street, the cost reflects that street repair, the street demolition, whereas if that street is being torn up anyway as part of a separate street project, there's some benefit or dual benefit from repairing the street as well as building the storm sewer utility below it. And finally, in this presentation, I'll go through again some resources and contacts for questions. National Flood Insurance Program, I've provided a link, has a lot of great information on how floods, or background on flood information, just kind of floods 101, but also kind of the whole flood insurance program overview as well. So it's a great resource to learn about how to protect yourself. That National Flood Hazard Layer that I referred to earlier, here's the link for that. Again, it's a great, the thing I love about it, because I have it up on my computer almost constantly, is it shows what the floodplain map is right here, reflecting all those letter of map changes that I talked about previously. FEMA Region 8 Flood Insurance Specialist. If your lender or your insurance agent has questions, Diana Herrera at FEMA Region 8 is FEMA's flood insurance specialist. This is her contact information. She is also a great resource for any specific insurance related questions on flood insurance. On the city side, the city stormwater engineer is Brandon Quiet. Here's his contact information. If you have questions on anything related to kind of stormwater, whether that be inlets or storm sewer or things like that, Brandon is the person to talk to. The city floodplain engineer, Mary Bosworth, she was the city's project manager throughout this project. I've also provided her contact information as well. And with that, thank you so much for your time. This has been a pleasure to work on this project with the city, and look forward to serving the community in the future. Thank you.